Welcome. In this video, I'll be discussing my Alchemist Oracle, introducing the set, describing what it is and how it was organized, and explaining how it can be used. This is an original Oracle set, originally created for my personal use, but later offered as a product for sale at the Game Crafter. The process of creating this deck began not intentionally, but with my study of divination. I was interested in learning the various systems available for oracular work and divination and began studying them in detail to learn the symbols and their meanings. So starting with the Norse Elder Futhark runes, I was then also studying the Irish Celtic Ogham system, the line alphabet, although it's not strictly an alphabet, of Irish Celts and particularly the Druids and other learned persons. Of course, I studied the classical tarot to learn the individual cards and meanings, and also such things as the Greek alphabet oracle, the astrologoi or sheep's knucklebone oracle of the Greeks and Romans, and the I Ching, the Chinese geomantic oracle. And as I was studying these systems and noting down the various symbols and their meanings, I noticed that some systems covered more meanings more thoroughly, and many systems skipped over or omitted meanings that were present in the other systems. Now, that's not to say that they're necessarily incomplete, because in addition to its literal and figurative meanings, a symbol can be interpreted differently in the context of the reading, in the context that it's drawn, in relationship to other symbols. So there can be more different meanings covered, not even counting the reader's intuition about possible alternate interpretations. But by themselves, the individual symbols tended to cluster, cover more meanings better in some systems, worse in others. In particular, it'll come as no surprise to readers of the tarot that that was the set best suited for criticism, complaint, and warnings about trouble in the future, with a lot of negatively interpreted cards. I will note also that the Greek alphabet oracle tends to focus on matters of luck, particularly luck in business, but that again may be a cultural artifact of how it was used and what people were typically asking of the oracle. There are other ways certainly that the same symbols can be used and interpreted. But what I wanted to aim at was if it was possible to create a finite symbol set that was still more complete, covered more of the range of possible semantic meanings. Originally, my thought was to do this in terms of archetypes or prototype symbols, things with wide universal meaning, like a skull for death or mortality, or a coin for luck or profit. Now, there are other modern oracles that have done similar things. One in particular I remember seeing, the Pirate Dice Oracle, has symbols like skull and crossbones, treasure chest, keg of rum, with obvious and then more elaborate interpreted meanings. But what I was aiming at was not something themed or specific in that way, but the general use that I could use for myself that would give more possible meanings. And the symbol set that I hit on as a possibility, I'm surprised I didn't think of initially, back from those days when I was doodling magical symbols in my high school notebooks, was the symbols of classical Western alchemy. Now, I say it that way to differentiate from, particularly, the alchemies of Europe from the alchemies of the Middle East and of the Far East, particularly Chinese and Arabic, which had their own traditions and own symbol sets and interpretations, many of which did feed back and inform European alchemists. But they are distinct, and that's what I want to specify. And I also say classical alchemy to distinguish it from any modern interpretations and understandings or chemistry. So this was the tradition and practice of that time and place. I'll note that this ties in nicely at the time with my beginning of devotional work to a new patron, Hermes, considering that alchemy is a part of Hermetic practice, one of the three main arts, along with astrology and theomancy. So that combine in nicely. As I was reading through, I got more and more confirmed that this was a good choice because there's a wealth of symbols and a wealth of attached meanings. In particular, there isn't just the literal and connected meanings of each symbol. There are also magical and personal meanings attached. There's something called the alchemy of the soul or the alchemy of the self, which has to do with personal transformation, just as much as physical transformation of matter. And for many alchemists, the two were closely linked, perhaps even sympathetic to one another. So, and I'll note also that you'll see a lot of that symbology and meaning already in the classic tarot. Usually if you ask a question like, why are there a white and black pillar? Or what's this symbol? It'll often tie back to Hermetic practice and alchemy in particular. So the precedents were there. And reading through, I started to make notes about what each symbol was, what the concept was that it was attached to, and possible divinatory meanings. What might this symbol mean in a oracular reading? How could it be interpreted? Doing this, I started to focus on a set of symbols that had strong, clear, distinct meanings that weren't overlapping with other symbols, and that had specific relevance within classical alchemy. So from a wide set of possibilities, I started to narrow it down and ended up with a set of about 40 or so symbols as a starting set. From these, I narrowed down the set even further and ended up with a final set of 36 symbols that I thought were significant. I ruled out things that tended to overlap with other concepts or that I didn't understand or couldn't represent the meaning well. In the next section, I'll talk more about the final set that was selected for the Alchemist Oracle, how those break down into different types and have different meanings. So I mentioned that in going through the symbol system for the various alchemical symbols, I started to narrow it down. I also sorted those symbols into 4 general categories. They naturally fell into these sets. The first being substances, physical elements or matter of various types, metals, non-metallic elements, compounds, more complex substances like wax or oil. The second set were the processes, the verbs of alchemy, things that were done to those substances like boiling, freezing, chopping, or sublimation, allowing them to vaporize into a gas. The third set were the tools used for those processes. Particularly the most important tools had their own symbols, like the crucible for calcination or burning, alembics, retorts, and the still for distillation. The final set were abstract concepts that didn't really fit into the other 3, such as the great work itself, or magnum opus, the 5th element or spirit element, quintessence, or the universal solvent or alkahest. So there were a few of those that had distinct symbols but didn't fit the other 3 categories. Now from those sets, I started to narrow down what were the most important symbols out of those sets, what overlapped in meaning with other things, and I discarded some in this process that I might want to add back later, and I'll discuss those individually in a little bit. But what I ended up with a set of about 40 items originally, and I narrowed those further to 36 symbols, which divided neatly into 7 distinct sets. So I'll address those specifically. The first and easiest set was the classical elements, that is fire, water, earth, and air. There's 4 cards. They had very clear and separable meanings, very useful for oracular readings. The next set were 3 elements, prime elements they're called in alchemy, also with major significance: salt, quicksilver, and sulfur, corresponding roughly to the body, the mind, and the spirit, or in another way, the mundane, the intellect, and the supernatural. The next set of elements that I chose were the 7 noble metals, representing stages in the alchemical process, going from lead to gold. So that's lead, tin, iron, copper, quicksilver, silver, and gold, in that order, from least to most pure. Now there is a eighth noble metal some will include, platinum, as even more pure and more elevated than gold. I did include it in the set, but not as a noble metal because it wasn't always attested in classical sources. It was something that was discovered and purified much later, but it's in there as a metal. So that's the other remaining set of substances, is all the other elements and compounds that I thought were significant enough and clear enough of meaning to be included. So platinum, other metals like zinc, magnesium, metalloids like antimony, and then a few other non-metallic elements and some compounds like borax, potash, and potash instead of potassium because it was not known as a pure element but as a salt, and phosphorus. So that is the set of remaining substances. The next set of cards that I chose started with processes, and there are four main stages in the great work that needed their own symbols and their own cards. Those were first nigredo, which starts with calcination, but nigredo or blackening. Second stage, albedo or whitening or cleansing. The third general stage is citrinitas, yellowing, fermentation, the fertility and processing. And finally, rubedo or reddening, the solidification and finalization of the finished product, the philosopher's stone or gold or whatever your end goal is. These general stages can be further broken down into 7 distinct key processes, which also correspond to the 7 noble metals. That begins with, as I mentioned, calcination, burning, separating elements apart by applying heat to loosen them from one another. Then dissolution, adding water or another solvent in order to pull those burned and separated pieces apart to cleanse your intended substances. Separation is the third stage, to take those pieces further apart and into their individual sets and categories to make pure elements of the separate types. Fourth stage is now combination or conjugation, to take the separated elements and recombine them in the way that you intend, your particular recipe or plan. This is followed by a fifth stage, fermentation, where those combined elements react. They create something new, a compound, a new substance. Sometimes that is literal fermentation, sometimes other slower processes. That product then can be taken and distilled to make it stronger and more pure. We know it in the sense of distilling alcohol, but other substances could be boiled or vaporized or otherwise encouraged to become more pure and strong by taking the unwanted byproducts off. And then the final stage is coagulation. Like with blood, it means hardening, solidifying, taking the result of distillation and compacting it to something more solid and stable. And then again, this could be the philosopher's stone as the final endpoint of the great work. The last set, of course, then is those remaining concepts, the great work itself, the universal solvent or alkahest, and I included vitriol, which is a substance, an acid, but it was one with particular notable properties, sometimes called liquid fire, for containing the spark that could set off the process. It was part of the calcination process sometimes. You'll note that there were some things also that were omitted. Other types of metals, nickel, cobalt, were known to classical alchemists, but not as well attributed, not as well defined as distinct. So I didn't include them at first, but I might add them later with modern understandings. There was a concept that got left out that I'd like to put back, the caput mortuum, or death head. That is the remains left over after burning, the unwanted waste, which could include carbon, very important for organic chemistry, not as important to the alchemists. There's also an additional stage beyond coagulation called projection, which was sometimes included and is in modern understandings as an eighth and additional step, where you take the stone, the result of the great work, and use it, apply it to create a new process, to start something that wasn't possible before. You use it as a catalyst. And that creates the great work as more of a cycle as opposed to a straight line. You do your whole process, you end up with a little bit higher step, and then you do it again to get to the next step. So I like that idea, and I want to put it in future decks, the second edition of the Alchemist Oracle. I left out other kinds of acids, like aqua regia, also important, has its own distinct use and meaning. And I can't believe I left out aqua vitae, alcohol, which was certainly important to the alchemists who gave it its name, alcohol. And it has distinct meanings and understandings. Besides intoxication, it's also a unique type of solvent, a unique type of product of fermentation. So I thought it should get in there in future. So instead of 36 future deck, maybe 40 or 42 cards. Speaking of the cards themselves, then the next section I'll talk about how I assembled the physical cards, decided on how those would be illustrated and produced. So once I had my final symbol set, I moved on to make it into a physical deck for Oracle use. Now in the design, I had to go with what I knew, basic graphic design. I'm not an artist or a graphic designer per se. I would certainly love to do a version of this with more elaborate pictorial interpretations of the different elements. I can imagine several different ways that could go. And in fact, there already exist a number of very nice alchemy-based Oracle decks out there with different interpretations, much nicer art. And I encourage you to go check those out. Again, what I created was something that was meant to be simple and functional and hopefully very clear in its explanations. So that was my focus. Accordingly, I decided that the card would contain just 3 elements. The symbol, big and in the center, done in, for the most part, black line art. A title at the top, so describing what exactly that thing is. So here's an example, potash. You can see the symbol, the title, and then at the bottom is a short explanation. What is that thing? What set does it fit into? In this case, it's a compound. It was understood as a substance in the time, but we know that it's a combination of more elements. So at the bottom might say, the 7th process of the great work, or the 6th noble metal. So it tells you a little bit more about where that fits into the overall set. The symbols themselves, I chose one symbol for each card, for each concept, based on 2 main criteria. One, was it the most commonly used symbol across different sources? That is, was it a frequently known and used symbol, or was it one of the rarer, odder cases? For example, magnesium had at least 4 distinct separate symbol possibilities, each of which looked nothing like the others, as well as variants of each of those. So I had to settle on one. Brings me to my second criterion, could I draw it? That is, could I build that symbol in a clear way using just straight lines and curves? No elaborate swirls, spirals, no heavy sets of lines where they start to bleed into one another. Just what can I draw and is visible? So that narrowed it down to a single symbol for each, which I created and exported, added to the card with a background. I just used a parchment texture, trying to harken back to old tomes and alchemical writings, that crackly stained pattern. I also added a logo on the back. People have asked about, was it intended to evoke a alpha and omega symbol? That was not the original idea, although I like the additional symbolism, because I was trying to create a complete oracle, something that covered A to Z, or A alpha to omega. But what I was aiming at was originally just the A and O of Alchemist Oracle, and relating it to this symbol, the magnum opus, the Philosopher's Stone, the triangle squared and circled. So that's the idea that I was trying to evoke with that particular symbol. The alpha omega reference came as a bonus. And then, as I mentioned, the title is usually just a single word or 2 word. For most of the cards, that defaulted to basic black as well as the bottom text. But I started to think that some of the symbols and some of the words could use some additional color, and they help as another form of reference. So the easy ones are, of course, the classical elements. Fire is red, both in the text and the symbol. Earth green, water blue, air yellow. For the noble metals, often those metals have a distinct color. Some of those colors are named after their metals, like copper, gold, and silver. And others have a distinctive color. The whitish silver of platinum, bluish silver of zinc, and tin has that sort of coloration. Lead tends to be a silvery red, although there are other colors, obviously, yellow lead and white lead. But that's what I chose, was that particular imagery. Then other elements sometimes have corresponding colors. One of the unique ones that I went with, if you're familiar with the metal bismuth, it forms very rainbow colored crystals, very distinct crystal structures. So it got rainbow text, which tied in with its meaning of being complete, a full spectrum of containing all things within itself. So that was a good correspondence. The stages naturally are colored according to their names. Negrito is black, Albedo is white, Saturnitas is yellow, and Rubedo is red. It's in their names, so that was easy to choose. The processes, actually, I corresponded to the element that tends to dominate that process. So calcination is typically a process of burning, whether with actual fire or with symbolic fire, so it got red. Dissolution is blue for water. There's typically water or another liquid involved. One of the tricky ones was fermentation, which has a traditional color associated, bluish green. And you might think of that as a combination of water and earth. It's a wet and solid process. I just made it bluish green accordingly. And then things like the magnum opus naturally had to be gold, with gold as the end of many alchemical processes and recipes. But others got just basic black, like alkahest. It didn't need any particular coloration, and some of the other elements like potash. So once I'd made all these design decisions, I assembled the cards, and then it was on to the actual bulk of the work for the deck, a reader's guide. That is a guidebook with each of the symbols and its likely interpretation in an oracular reading. This was taking all of my notes, my knowledge about how I would read those symbols and what significance they had historically and in relation to others, and distilling it down to a single page, for each symbol in the guidebook. The first half of that page was the background. What is that thing, its definition, where does it fit historically, what's its significance? And then the second half was reading it in a oracle, in a divination reading. And I included both upright, normal readings, as well as a reversed upside down reading for those who wanted to do such things, who shuffle up and down in their deck, for example. Now, reversed meanings have different interpretations for different oracles and different divinations. In tarot, typically it's taken as the opposite of whatever that card normally means. I thought about it and I realized that for a lot of these meanings, they are an ideal, they are that thing in itself. And so reversed could be either too much, that is a surfeit of that particular thing, or too little, a lack. So for example, iron is interpreted in this reading as force, aggression, war, assertion, progress. But reversed, it could mean an excess of those things: aggression, violence, irrationality, or it could mean a lack thereof. So weakness, passivity, lack of assertion. So I wanted to include both of those. And individual readers can make their own choices or read it in the context of what they're doing, what they think is the best way to read it. And that's the last part then of the reader's guide, is some suggestions about how to draw and use the cards, how to read them individually and in combination with one another. I gave a couple sample layouts that might be useful. What I didn't include there, and what's going to be the subject of my next video, is a layout that I've since found very useful, one that I used in the past with tarot, and I can't believe I didn't originally think of it for the Alchemist Oracle. It's called the 4 element spread. You lay out the cards, north, south, east, west, not in that order. Northwest, east, south is the correct order. But I'll describe that more in the next video. But that is another method where not only the individual cards have meanings, but their order of draw, their placement, and their interrelationship to one another is informative. So again, like any other system, it builds up meanings, and then in context of what question was asked or who's asking. So in the next section, I'll talk a little bit about using the deck, how it's worked out, did I meet my goals? So in the final evaluation of the Alchemist Oracle, I believe that I did meet my goals in the original project. That is to create a more complete, wide-ranging deck with a finite symbol set that had personal relevance and is useful for divination. Comparing it to other symbol sets, I think I've covered a slightly wider range of possible meanings. Not perfect, and no set is going to be, but filled in some gaps and kept it tight within a particular theme, which is helpful both for the individual understandings of the cards and their interrelationships. I've used the deck in many cases and found it handy for divination, very often accurate to the extent that any divination or oracle method can be considered accurate. That is, it won't give you precise knowledge of the future, it won't give you the lottery numbers, but it might give you fair warning of problems to come or predict general trends. So it's been useful in that way. I found it especially useful for receiving messages from deities, particularly in the Hellenic pantheon, and especially, no surprise, from my patron Hermes. I use it exclusively as the divination deck in his devotional rites. And the ties to Hermeticism and the fact that he's a card in the deck, Quicksilver, probably help with that. It's very good for personal readings, which again, it was originally intended for my personal use, but also I think for others reading about themselves or matters of the spirit, tying into that idea of the alchemy of the soul, of personal transformation and purification. So when asked questions about where am I in life, where do I need to be going, how can I get there, what obstacles are in my way, it's very good for those kinds of meanings. On the other hand, what it's very bad for are external meanings. It's not great for predicting outside events, fortune, good luck, business ventures, particularly romantic questions. There are a few cards that could be interpreted that way, like gold, obviously, for profit, or copper conjunction for romantic entanglements could fit quite well as dissolution or separation for a divorce or other negative romantic. But those are extended interpretations within that context. And overall, it's not been very complete in that regard. So can't win everything. But again, I think the overall project was a success. It is a more complete symbol set that is useful for my personal divination. And other people have expressed interest and asked if I could create the deck for sale. That's where that started. I think they are more generally interested in the guidebook than the cards themselves, which is fine. And I'm happy to discuss with people about their interpretations. Often I found that they wanted to see if their interpretation matched up with mine, and for the most part, they tend to. We're all basing off of the same sources, really. I would love to develop the deck further, maybe add a few cards, as I've mentioned, to make it more complete, cover some aspects that weren't there or should be there. And if there was an artistic interpretation of these cards, that would be great if anybody's interested, either on your own or working with me. That would be amazing. But it is what it is now, and it works pretty well. So I'm happy with the result. If you'd like, check it out yourself on the Game Crafter, both as a product and as something you might like to purchase. And as I noted, there are two versions, one with a physical guidebook printed. It's a little small type, but it's portable. Or a printable, larger version, which it's cheaper, but you have to do the printing yourself. But whichever you like, take a look. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope you found this useful. Have a good day.